What happens when a boy is stripped of his identity and forced to live as a plaything for one of history's most infamous emperors? The story of Sporus, Rome's lost soul, may shock you in ways you never imagined. In ancient Rome, death was not just a consequence, it was an event, a spectacle. But it was not always the sword or the dagger that dealt the final blow. Sometimes it was a quieter, more insidious form of destruction: castration. To the emperors who reveled in their absolute power, the act was not merely a physical mutilation. It was a way of stripping the soul, rendering an individual powerless, voiceless, a mere puppet to the whims of the powerful. For Sporus, this was the beginning of his existence. Once a nameless boy from the dark streets of Rome, he was snatched from his family's embrace, his innocence taken as violently as the life of a slave. His body, a vessel meant for his own hopes and dreams, was transformed into something else entirely. His fate, sealed in an imperial palace, was no longer his own. Castrated, mutilated, and discarded, Sporus became an object, an experiment in the perverse desires of Emperor Nero. Nero, mad with the power of a god, saw in the boy more than a living being. He saw an extension of his own ego. Sporus was not a human. He was a living, breathing doll, a manifestation of Nero's darkest fantasies. With a wave of his hand, Nero could strip away not just Sporus's dignity, but his very essence. The boy became an image of absolute control, a symbol of an emperor's twisted obsession with perfection. He had no voice, no choice, no chance to resist. Rome's streets buzzed with rumors of Nero's increasingly erratic behavior. His thirst for pleasure knew no bounds, and yet, as the empire trembled on the brink of collapse, his cruelty grew more desperate. It was no longer enough to be adored. Nero sought to mold the world around him into his own distorted image. Sporus was nothing more than a vessel for that image. The boy's eyes, once wide with the promise of a life yet to be lived, were now clouded with fear. To Nero, Sporus was a canvas for his mad desires, a living testament to the emperor's delusions of grandeur. He would be dressed in silks, paraded through the streets as Nero's bride, his body displayed for all to see. It wasn't love, it wasn't affection, it was domination, a means of asserting control over both the man and the world around him. The boy's innocence was sacrificed at the altar of Nero's ego. Nero's obsessions would only deepen. As his grip on power began to slip, as enemies conspired behind his back and the weight of his own paranoia consumed him, the emperor turned to Sporus as a lifeline. The boy, broken and reformed in Nero's image, became the embodiment of the emperor's unyielding control. Yet this false sense of ownership, of power over another, only echoed Nero's own fragility. He had the world at his feet, but no one could escape the crushing weight of their own descent into madness. Sporus, once free to live in the shadows of Rome's cruel imperial reign, had now become the living manifestation of an empire's decline. His life, once full of promise, had been twisted into a grim narrative. Stripped of his family, his name, and his identity, Sporus was forced to navigate a world where he was a mere object, a reflection of Nero's desires. And in this tragic birth of a new reality, the boy's true worth, his humanity, was forever lost. As Rome's bright imperial future dimmed, so too did Sporus. His life became a reflection of the power's decay, a reflection that would continue to haunt the Roman Empire long after its fall. Watch till the end to uncover the tragic twist that sealed Sporus's fate forever. It is said that in ancient Rome, the most horrific of punishments was reserved for those who dared to defy the emperor's will, but the cruelties of Nero's reign went beyond the brutal spectacle of gladiatorial combat or the public execution of his enemies. Nero's most twisted indulgence was the transformation of a living being into an object of his own fractured psyche. This wasn't the destruction of a body. It was the annihilation of a soul. It was the case of Sporus, the boy who had been stripped of everything, including his very humanity. The act of castration had already sealed Sporus's fate, but it was Nero's obsessive need to possess him, to remake him in his own image, that would truly alter the boy's destiny. Nero, in his madness, saw in Sporus not a human being, but a tool, a symbol, a doll. To Nero, Sporus was not a person to love. He was a mirror reflecting the emperor's delusions of grandeur, a projection of his twisted desire for absolute control. Sporus was paraded through the imperial court, his presence a grotesque statement of Nero's unchecked power. No longer was he a boy with a name or a family. He was a plaything, the emperor's wife. Stripped of dignity, he was dressed in silks, adorned with jewelry, made to act the part of a woman in a public performance of domination. His body was the canvas for Nero's perverse fantasies. As the days blurred into nights, Nero's obsession grew. His empire teetered on the edge of ruin, but his indulgences only deepened. The screams of Rome's oppressed citizens, the whispers of conspiracy in the Senate, the plots to assassinate him, they all blended into the background as Nero's mind fixated on one thing: Sporus. The boy had become an extension of his power. He wasn't a symbol of love or even desire. Sporus had become a manifestation of Nero's need to assert his godlike authority over the world, over life itself. The emperor's obsession went beyond mere perversion. It was a desperate attempt to control the uncontrollable. The ancient world had seen men fall to madness before, but Nero's collapse was both tragic and inevitable. His belief that he could wield such power even over a human soul was a reflection of his own inner decay. Sporus, forever caught in the grip of the emperor's delusions, was a ghost of what he might have been. His innocence, his humanity, stripped away in the pursuit of Nero's madness. What had once been a child full of potential had now become the centerpiece of Nero's fractured world. And as Nero's empire crumbled, with revolts rising in the provinces and plots against his life being hatched behind closed doors, he clung tighter to Sporus. The boy was no longer an individual, he was a symbol. The emperor's obsession with him grew from madness into a need, an unshakable belief that Sporus was, in some twisted way, the key to Nero's survival. But Sporus, a prisoner in Nero's palace, was sinking deeper into a living hell of his own. His mind, once free to dream of a life of his own, was now imprisoned in the golden cage that Nero had built. The emperor's twisted love had crushed whatever shred of innocent Sporus had left. But worse still, Sporus was now the embodiment of Nero's worst fears. The emperor could control armies, the loyalty of his court, the lives of thousands, but Sporus? Sporus had become the embodiment of his ultimate, all-consuming vulnerability. As Nero's obsession spiraled further, a shadow loomed over them both, a realization that no matter how tightly Nero gripped the reins of power, nothing could prevent the inevitable collapse. His empire was crumbling, his enemies closing in, but his need to control Sporus remained a terrifying constant. Sporus was a living testament to Nero's delusion, a boy who was both loved and destroyed, a prisoner of an emperor's obsession. And in the cruelest irony, Nero's greatest fear would eventually be realized. The more he sought to control Sporus, the more he lost control of himself. In ancient Rome, the arena of life and death was a stage where the emperor played the part of a god, and the crowd, always hungry for blood, became his devout followers. But the public spectacle that Nero sought to create was not limited to gladiatorial combat or the brutal slaughter of animals. For Nero, the ultimate form of control lay in turning human suffering into entertainment, transforming every corner of his empire into a living theater of cruelty. And Sporus, the boy who had already been stripped of his name and dignity, became the emperor's most grotesque performance. In an empire so obsessed with spectacle, where blood and gore were as regular as the daily sun, Nero's twisted desire for power manifested in the public degradation of his most prized possession, Sporus. To him, the boy was no longer a person. He was a symbol, a living image of control, humiliation, and fear. It wasn't enough for Nero to hide his perversions in the confines of the palace. He wanted the entire empire to see. The boy who had been remade in his image would be paraded, displayed for all to see, his suffering an offering to the crowds that cheered for the emperor's cruelty. What kind of man, what kind of ruler would humiliate a child for sport? Nero was not simply a leader. He was a man whose very identity was consumed by his insatiable thirst for dominance. He knew that in order to cement his power, he had to convince the people that he was untouchable. And what better way to do so than to bend another human being to his will, breaking them before the public's eyes? He manipulated Sporus into something unrecognizable, turning him from a boy into a living representation of Rome's decayed moral center. The public humiliations began, and with each one, the boy's humanity eroded further. He was dragged through the streets, dressed in women's clothes, as Nero's entourage marched behind him in a bizarre procession. The people watched, not with the sympathy one might expect for a victim, but with voyeuristic fascination. Rome's elites and commoners alike reveled in the grotesque performance, their eyes glinting with dark amusement at the emperor's bizarre creation. This was no longer a man's reign. It was a spectacle of degradation, where suffering and humiliation were part of the entertainment. The emperor, convinced that his manipulation of Sporus was both divine and political, continued to parade the boy through celebrations, each one more perverse than the last. His role as Nero's wife was no longer just a private affair. It was a mockery of marriage, a grotesque imitation of love played out before the eyes of the public. The crowds cheered, unaware, or perhaps indifferent, that in their hunger for spectacle they had lost touch with the very essence of humanity. Nero's reign was built on the suffering of others, and Sporus was the most visible, most tragic symbol of that truth. The final humiliation came during a grotesque marriage ceremony. The emperor, in his insanity, insisted that Sporus be married to him in a public display, as though the boy's body, once a vessel of innocence, had become a mere object to be claimed. The ceremony was grotesque, not just in its perversion, but in its demonstration of Rome's moral rot. Nero, standing at the altar with his helpless, mutilated bride, was a living embodiment of the empire's darkest excesses. This moment marked not just Sporus's personal torment, but the final nail in the coffin of Rome's empire, the corruption so deeply ingrained in the system that it had seeped into the very hearts of its rulers. As Sporus stood at the altar, broken and humiliated, the echoes of his suffering would resonate far beyond the ceremony itself. For this spectacle was not just about power. It was about an emperor's need to bend the world to his will and a society that had allowed him to do so. It is said that the collapse of an empire is not always marked by a great battle or an army's defeat. Sometimes it comes from the slow, suffocating unraveling of its ruler's mind. Nero's empire had already begun to crumble, its foundation weakened by paranoia, fear, and corruption, but it was the emperor's descent into madness that would bring it to its final irrevocable ruin. In the fevered grasp of his insanity, Nero's need for control intensified, and the boy he once molded into a symbol of his power became a ghost in the shadow of that same power. Sporus, broken and remade, was now a living casualty of Nero's unraveling mind. As Nero's grip on power loosened, the empire's endless indulgence turned into an all-consuming terror. His enemies closed in, whispers of revolt grew louder, and the emperor's paranoia turned inward. Every whisper, every shadow, every breath in the palace became a threat. He was no longer the godlike ruler who stood above all others. He was a man drowning in his own fear, spiraling into madness. But in his eyes, Sporus was no longer just a trophy. No, the boy had become a symbol of something much darker. He was a reminder of Nero's control, a symbol that would soon be shattered. Once, Sporus had been the emperor's living doll, his ornament of perverse desire. But as Nero's paranoia festered, Sporus transformed into something far more dangerous in the emperor's mind. No longer a symbol of lust, Sporus became the emperor's obsession, a reflection of Nero's fear of his own loss of power. The boy's body, already ravaged by Nero's cruelty, had now become a psychological battleground. Nero could no longer see Sporus as a person. He was a reminder of everything the emperor feared: the collapse of his power, the loss of his empire, and the ravages of his own guilt and madness. Nero's paranoia bled into his every action. The lavish feasts, the public spectacles, and the excesses that had once defined his reign began to feel like a hollow performance. As the empire turned its back on him, Nero became consumed by his own delusions of persecution. He saw enemies everywhere, inside his court, in his closest allies, even in the very air he breathed. His once grand plans turned to ashes as his mind fractured. Yet, amidst the chaos, one thing remained constant: Sporus. The boy, now a broken shell of his former self, was trapped in the emperor's web of fear. Sporus had lost his name, his humanity, and now he was losing his sanity too. The trauma of his mutilation, his degradation, had begun to wear away at his soul. What had once been a boy filled with life had become a man living in the shadow of a tyrant's insanity. As Nero spiraled, Sporus was forced to watch the empire and his own mind decay in tandem. He had been reduced to an object, but the weight of that objecthood was breaking him. The psychological toll of servitude under Nero's madness was as cruel as the physical torment he had endured. But as the emperor's reign crumbled, so did Sporus. In the absence of any real control, Nero sought to drown out the chaos with more violence, more fear. The two of them, trapped in a symbiotic madness, fed off each other's pain. Nero's crumbling empire was reflected in the shattered remains of Sporus's identity. Neither could escape their inevitable fall. And as Nero's decisions grew darker, Sporus was left to endure not just the external cruelties, but the internal decay of his mind. The boy who had once been a symbol of imperial desire had become, like Nero himself, a hollow shell. In the final hours of Nero's reign, the emperor's insanity reached its peak. The boy, forever twisted by the emperor's whims, stood as a ghost haunting the ruins of his master's mind. There was no escape, no salvation for Sporus. Nero's madness had cost them both their humanity. In the shadow of an empire's collapse, both emperor and pawn would find themselves consumed by the very power they once controlled. The air was thick with betrayal. The empire that Nero had once ruled with a fevered thirst for control was now crumbling beneath him. The streets of Rome, once filled with praise for his extravagant shows, his brutal displays of power, were now filled with murmurs of revolt. Nero's enemies closed in from all sides, and in his paranoid mind, the walls of the palace seemed to grow ever closer. His downfall was no longer a distant possibility. It was inevitable. Yet, as Nero's empire collapsed in a maelstrom of violence and treachery, one truth remained tragically clear. Sporus, the boy who had once been his living ornament, would pay the price for Nero's unchecked madness. Sporus had long ceased to be a person in the eyes of Nero. He was an object, a symbol of imperial excess. Yet, now that the emperor's power was slipping through his fingers, the boy found himself abandoned by the very man who had reshaped him into something unrecognizable. As Nero's enemies pressed harder, as his own army turned against him, Sporus, once at the center of Nero's twisted affection, was now cast aside, left to face the brutal consequences of the emperor's downfall. The irony was impossible to ignore. Nero had sought to immortalize his power through spectacle, through cruelty, but he would be remembered for his shame. His once legendary cruelty would not secure his place in history. Instead, it would be his cowardice that marked the final chapter of his reign. As his enemies closed in, Nero tried to flee, but in his final moments, his world, built on violence and spectacle, crumbled. The emperor, who had turned Rome into a grotesque stage for his whims, was reduced to a mere shadow of his former self. But what of Sporus, the boy who had been so deeply entangled in Nero's madness? As Nero's reign disintegrated, so did Sporus. The boy, who had once been nothing more than a tool in the emperor's mind, was now forgotten. The world had no place for him, just as it had no place for the broken remnants of Nero's empire. In the darkness of the collapse, Sporus was left to fade into obscurity, a tragic symbol of Rome's moral decay. While Nero's final days were filled with shame and regret, Sporus's existence was stripped of meaning. His name, once tied to imperial excess, would be lost to the annals of history. Nero's last act, the desperate attempt to escape, to flee from the consequences of his tyranny, was a final, haunting reflection of the man's collapse. The emperor had built his empire on the suffering of others, and in the end, it was the suffering of those closest to him that proved to be his undoing. Sporus, once a symbol of Nero's ultimate control, had become a casualty of that power's decay. The boy, now a ghost of the man he once was, would never be remembered as anything more than the emperor's broken toy. The true tragedy, however, lay not in the fall of Nero alone. It lay in the destruction of the people he left behind. The memory of Nero would be remembered for the destruction he wrought on Rome, for the cruelty he imposed on his people. But Sporus, his once cherished vessel of power, would be forgotten. His suffering, the years of torment he endured, would fade into the shadows of history, a silent reminder of the price of absolute power. As the empire fell, and as Nero met his untimely end, a question lingered in the air. What remains of those who are crushed beneath the weight of imperial excess? Is it legacy, vengeance, or simply the forgotten pain of a world that has moved on? Comment below. What do you think was the true cost of Nero's madness? How do you think history will remember those crushed beneath his empire?